Human civilization is built on pyramids. And I'm not just talking about the stone ones baking under the Egyptian sun, but invisible structures, hierarchies of thought, layers of meaning, and levels of thinking that range from the most basic impulses to the heights of true revelation. And yet, despite the astonishing tools, knowledge, and information available to us today, most people never climb past the very first steps. In school, in politics, in culture, and especially online, the majority of society still operates at the lowest layers of thinking, remembering, or more accurately, simply regurgitating everything that they've been told. Not thinking for themselves, not questioning or examining, just echoing. Words without the weight, opinions without origin, beliefs without understanding. And here's the terrifying part. Most people don't even realize there are higher levels of thinking that you can ascend. Why have we all forgotten how to think? And what happens to a society when no one wants to think beyond the surface? These are the highest levels of thinking, and why society is stuck at the bottom. In 1956, an educational psychologist named Benjamin Bloom unveiled something that he called the taxonomy of educational objectives, a structural hierarchy on how humans learn, think, and process information. It was originally designed for teachers, a way to help students progress from basic memorization to deeper, more sophisticated forms of thought. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a framework for classrooms. This was a blueprint for human cognition itself, a kind of mental pyramid that reveals why some people develop clarity, perspective, and wisdom, while others remain stuck repeating what they've been told without actually having any deeper understanding of those things. And the fact that he made it a pyramid and not just a staircase meant that Bloom accidentally created the perfect metaphor for modern society. Because today, most people are stuck at the very bottom of that pyramid, and the higher you go through the levels, the fewer people there are. For those who don't know, here's a brief explanation of the pyramid. At the bottom you have remembering, which is simply repeating the information you've been given verbatim. The next is understanding, the ability to explain ideas in your own words. Application means using the information to solve simple problems. After that comes analysis, the ability to compare, contrast, break things apart, and see the hidden structure behind ideas. Evaluating allows you to form judgments and determine priorities. And finally, at the very top, you have creating, the rarest level, where you take everything you've learned and synthesize it into something genuinely new. A fresh idea, a new model, a new perspective that didn't exist before. Unfortunately, most of humanity never reaches level 4, while some never even reach level 2. But the crisis isn't just that people fail to reach the top, it's that they don't know they're stuck at the bottom. They believe that they're thinking simply because information is passing through their minds. It's like riding shotgun and convincing yourself that you're the one steering. Now, we live in an era of unprecedented access to knowledge. The entire sum of human history is available in your pocket. And yet that paradox is painful. The more information that we have, the less we seem to understand. We confuse awareness with comprehension. We confuse memory with intelligence. We confuse noise with depth. To understand this crisis and the path out of it, we have to start with the foundation. Level 1, remembering, the age of regurgitation. This is where most online discourse lives. It's the land of slogans, sound bites, TikTok commentary, and inherited opinions. It's the cognitive equivalent of fast food. It's all pre-cooked, pre-chewed, pre-digested. There's not really any thinking required, you just have to repeat what you saw. That's why you can scroll for 10 minutes and see 50 people expressing the same hot take in slightly different words. It's why political debates devolve into a shouting match between people who don't actually understand the very talking points that they're repeating. It's why misinformation spreads faster than truth. Truth requires you to think. Falsehood only requires volume. Level 1 thinkers believe they're engaging, but they're merely parroting. They've outsourced cognition to influencers, tribes, pundits, and algorithms. Theirs is a second-hand experience. It's a borrowed mind. They are, in a sense, intellectually asleep while imagining themselves fully awake. Level 2. Understanding. The illusion of comprehension. Some people climb one level higher. They can explain an idea back to you. They understand the words, the definitions, the basic structure of information. But this is still a fragile understanding, one that collapses the moment life becomes at all complicated. This is where a lot of online debaters end up. These are people whose ideas only work on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Once you introduce any sort of nuance into the conversation, their entire argument collapses and their worldview becomes threatened. Imagine someone explaining inflation, crime rates, mental health, addiction, social inequality. Well, they can define the terms, describe the concept, maybe even give a few examples. But they've never stepped back to ask the next question. What does any of that truly mean? And how do I know this is true? And what else might explain this? The illusion of comprehension is one of the most dangerous cognitive traps, and it's why most pseudo-intellectuals end up at the second level. People who know they are uninformed are capable of learning, while people who believe they understand when they don't, well, they can get stuck forever. Bloom's hierarchy wasn't meant to describe society, yet it has become the perfect metaphor for the modern world. We are drowning in information but starving for insight. We're plugged into infinite content and yet disconnected from actual thought. The lowest levels, which should be only the starting point for deeper thinking, have become the entire destination. Civilization has flattened into a single plane, where the easiest form of cognition dominates every conversation, repeating what somebody else has already said. If you want to understand why society feels fractured, shallow, polarized, exhausted, anxious, and overwhelmed, you have to understand how we got stuck at the bottom of the pyramid. And to understand that, we need to go deeper into the psychology of the modern mind. There is no conspiracy, no villain pulling the strings from some hidden shadow. The real enemy is a combination of evolution, emotion, technology, and culture, all working together like gravity, pulling the mind towards the path of least resistance. And the brain? It loves efficiency, not the truth. The human brain, frankly, wasn't built for philosophy. It wasn't built for abstraction, long-term planning, or even careful reflection. It was built for survival in a dangerous world. Spotting threats, reacting quickly, conserving energy, and avoiding uncertainty. Thinking deeply is metabolically expensive. It burns real calories. The brain is only 2% of your body weight, yet it consumes around 20% of your energy, and every time you engage in higher level cognition, whether that's analyzing, evaluating, or creating, your brain is doing something evolution never optimized it for. In psychology, this has a formal name: cognitive miserliness. The brain uses as little mental energy as possible. It prefers shortcuts, heuristics, patterns, and familiar answers. And odds are you've experienced this in small ways. Skimming instead of actually studying, watching summaries instead of reading the book, nodding at an idea that you don't actually fully grasp. The mind is wired to avoid effort unless effort is necessary for survival. This is why the bottom of the pyramid feels good. The first levels, remembering, understanding, and maybe even applying, are relatively mentally cheap. They rely on pre-existing neural pathways, and they reward repetition. They don't require any restructuring of your beliefs, no discomfort, and no conflict with the tribe. The higher levels, however, analyze, evaluate, create, those demand reconstruction. They require friction. They force the brain to wrestle with conflicting data, suppressing emotional impulses, and challenging its own identity. Evolution doesn't like that, so it punishes you for trying. Thinking deeply literally feels bad at first. There's this cognitive soreness, the mental equivalent of lifting a heavy weight at the gym for the first time. Now, unfortunately, most people mistake that discomfort as a sign that they should stop, or even worse, they take it as evidence of failure, which I'll assure you now it is not. This phenomenon, called the misinterpreted effort hypothesis, explains why the climb up Bloom's pyramid feels impossible for the average person. The moment thinking stops becoming smooth and effortless, people assume, well, I'm confused, I must not be smart enough, something's wrong with this argument, this topic is just too complicated for me, or I'll just trust someone else's explanation. Well, what they don't realize is that difficulty is the doorway to intelligence. Discomfort is the signal that you are rising into higher cognition. Most people turn around at the first sign of struggle, mistaking an uphill climb for a dead end. And that's not because they're incapable or stupid, they're not. But it's because nobody taught them that deeper thinking requires discomfort. Nobody told them that thinking has a weight to it. Nobody told them that burning means you're growing. There's also the fact that deep thought does require time, a lot of which you don't get in our society today. As humans, we used to lay down and stare at the stars each night surrounded by loved ones around a fire. We had time to pause, think, reflect, and tell stories. Today, people wake up exhausted. They work jobs that drain them, scroll feeds that overstimulate them, and live in a world where attention is always fragmented. Thinking in such a world has become a luxury, one that most of the population can simply not afford. And so society stays on level 1, simply because it is the only level that fits their schedule. If evolution made thinking hard, while technology made it unnecessary, today's digital world is engineered to reward the lowest levels of cognition. Social media feeds are structured around instant reaction, instant outrage, instant validation, instant identity reinforcement, instant emotional stimulation, instant. And nothing, not a thing about this environment rewards slow, reflective thought. Platforms make more money when you operate at the bottom of the pyramid. They want you to remember, share, react, repeat, and by the way, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Analysis slows you down. Evaluation breaks the emotional loop. Creation takes time. In essence, deep thought is bad for business. So the internet spoon-feeds society pre-packaged opinions, bite-sized takes, and tribal narratives the way a parent feeds a toddler mashed peas. And like toddlers, most people swallow whatever's given to them. Not because they're stupid, but because chewing is just difficult. Technology has become a cognitive prosthetic. We outsource our memories to cloud storage, social understanding to influencers, curiosity goes to the algorithms, creativity, leave that to the AI, opinions, let the tribe speak. Every year, more mental labor moves from the biological mind to the digital one, and outsourcing always comes with the cost. Unused ability withers. When calculators became common, arithmetic skills dropped. When GPS became common, navigational intuition disappeared. When search engines became common, factual memory worsened. So, what happens when we start to outsource thinking itself? Well, we are beginning to find out. According to a global survey, nearly half of adolescents between the ages 12 and 15 do not meet the minimum level of reading comprehension set by education standards around the world. In other words, almost half of the younger generation struggle to read with understanding, not just decoding words, but grasping meaning and context. In the United States, the latest national assessment testing reveals a worrying downward trend. In 2024, reading scores for 4th and 8th graders dropped again. This marks the third straight decline. In 2025, a high school senior cohort recorded their lowest reading and math performance in decades, with over 30% lacking basic reading skills. At the same time, surveys show a decline in voluntary reading and engagement with text. A recent 2025 literacy survey of young people ages 8 to 18 found only about 1 in 3 said they enjoy reading in their free time, the lowest reported reading enjoyment rate in 2 decades. These aren't isolated trends, they are revealing a worrying pattern. As educational and cognitive demands shift outward to your screen, the algorithm, or search engines, foundational capacities like reading comprehension, sustained attention, and independent thinking are getting worse. So what does this mean for politics, culture, and public discourse? Well, politics becomes about who can deliver the most emotionally charged, bite-sized message. Public discourse devolves into repetition of surface-level opinions rather than genuine debate. And all of this has led to one of the worst things that we are experiencing today. Perhaps the most powerful force keeping society at the bottom is identity. Most people don't realize this, but by adulthood, their beliefs are no longer cognitive, they're tribal. Once an idea becomes part of someone's identity, they stop thinking about it altogether, but they defend it. They protect it, they justify it, and they repeat it, all without pausing to question it. Everything becomes a loyalty test. My group believes this. Well, people like me say this. My side supports this. Well, I can't question this, it's who I am. Identity collapses the pyramid into a single step. There's no need to climb if the goal is not truth, but belonging. And the tragedy is this. The smarter a person is, the better they are at justifying their tribal beliefs. Intelligence doesn't automatically lift people up on the pyramid. Sometimes it actually traps them even deeper at the bottom, because they can create more elaborate excuses for why they shouldn't climb. When access to information becomes infinite, people assume understanding becomes infinite too. I saw a video on it. I read a headline. Well, I know what this means. I already understand this issue. Information creates the illusion of expertise. Knowledge creates the illusion of wisdom. And society confuses both with thought. Why climb if you believe you're already at the top? Identity-based thinking also favors emotion over cognition. People don't ask, well, is this true? They ask, how does this make me feel? And feelings are the enemy of higher order thinking. Because analysis requires emotional distance. Evaluation requires neutrality. Creation requires clarity. But today's cultural climate treats emotions as sacred. If something offends, challenges, or discomforts, it's rejected outright, long before the mind has the chance to properly engage with it. The pyramid collapses whenever the heart overpowers the head. If the lower levels of Bloom's pyramid represent the gravitational pull of modern life, then the upper levels represent something radically different. Intentional cognition. The kind of thinking that doesn't happen by accident. The kind of thinking that you have to choose. It's cultivated, built like a muscle. And most people never experience it. That, again, not because they're incapable, but because true thinking feels nothing like what we've been taught. It's slower, stranger, it's more uncomfortable, more humbling, and yet far more transformative. To understand the path upward, we must first shatter a myth. Climbing into a higher level of thinking isn't about consuming more information or having more opinions or collecting facts like they're souvenirs. It's about changing the relationship between you and your thoughts. So, let's break down how this actually works and what separates real thinking from its cheap imitations. At level 4, thinking becomes structural. You're no longer simply absorbing ideas, you're taking them apart, like an engineer studying the blueprint instead of admiring the building. Analysis is the art of comparison. How do A and B differ? What assumptions underlie each? What patterns keep repeating? What contradictions hide beneath the surface? But genuine analysis requires something that our culture has almost forgotten: intellectual patience. You cannot analyze anything if you're rushing. You can't analyze anything if you're emotionally triggered. You can't analyze anything if you're only seeking confirmation. Analysis begins with slowing down enough to ask a simple but revolutionary question. What's actually going on here? Not what you want to be happening, not what you've been told is happening, but what is actually happening. This moment, the pause, the distance, the disidentification, is the first real step towards higher cognition. You're no longer the puppet of your thoughts. You're the puppeteer pulling the strings. Once you can compare ideas, the mind must take the next uncomfortable step: judgment. Evaluation is level 5, and it's often misunderstood. People assume judgment means criticism. In reality, it means prioritization. Given multiple truths, which matters most? Given multiple perspectives, which one is the strongest? Given multiple values, which takes precedence? Evaluation requires bravery, because it forces you to commit, to take a stance, to say, this matters more than that. This is not the arrogance of certainty, it's the humility of responsibility. Most people avoid level 5 because evaluation requires emotional regulation, delayed gratification, tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to admit ignorance, and the ability to revise beliefs. Evaluation is the first level in which thinking becomes an ethical act. Here, you're no longer just collecting information, you are shaping it into a worldview. At the top of the pyramid lies level 6, synthesis, originality, and creation. Most people misunderstand the word creativity. They think it's artistic, aesthetic, or expressive. But the deepest definition of creation, in Bloom's own terms, is this: the ability to produce something that did not exist before, using the knowledge you understand, the patterns you've analyzed, and the judgments that you've formed. This could be a new solution, a new model, a new explanation, a new metaphor, a new idea that reframes the entire problem. Creation is the highest level because it represents a total transformation of how your mind interacts with reality. You are no longer a consumer of ideas, you are a generator of them. And here's the secret that very few people understand. The top of the pyramid is not about intelligence. It's about freedom. Because when you can create ideas, you are no longer controlled by the ones that you inherit. This is the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. However, we're going to have some fun here. There is one more level that I felt I had to address in this video. So, Bloom's taxonomy explains how we think. Metacognition explains who is doing the thinking. This is the shadow level above the pyramid, the dimension that turns thought into reflection. Metacognition is the ability to watch your own mind the way you watch a movie. You're observing the observer. And you begin to notice, well, I tend to react emotionally to this topic. Or, I'm defending this idea because it protects my identity. I'm drawn to this conclusion because it feels comfortable. My desire to be right is preventing me from seeing what's true. It's like you're unlocking the ability to debug your own mind, to identify cognitive biases, emotional triggers, and blind spots in real time. Metacognition is the spiritual evolution of the intellect. It turns the mind into both subject and object. And once you can think about your own thinking, well, the lower levels lose their power over you. Everything above, analysis, evaluation, creation, metacognition, none of it is innate, it's not genetic, it's not a gift granted to a chosen few, no. It's a skill. And like any skill, it strengthens with use and decays with neglect. So I've said that society is stuck at the bottom, and that's not because people lack the ability to rise through the ranks. I want to reiterate, these people are not stupid. It's just because they don't practice enough to get better. Real thinking feels different. It's slower, it's heavier, deeper, more uncertain, more revealing, and it's sometimes quite painful. But it is also more meaningful than anything happening at the lower levels. Because when you climb the pyramid, you reclaim something humanity has been losing for decades: agency over your own mind. And you stop being like the echo of myths. You stop being simply a reaction. You stop being a vessel carried by cultural currents, and you begin to navigate the world with conscious intention. You become someone who creates instead of someone who simply consumes. And this is how true thinking works. It is not easy, but it is liberating. Now we turn to the final and most important question. How do we rise? Not just in theory, but in practice. The truth is, most people never rise, not because they can't, but because they were never shown how. Thinking, real thinking, feels like walking uphill through deep sand, but there is a path and there are steps. There is a way upward. And it all starts with step 1. Slow down the mind. In a world obsessed with velocity, the single most radical thing you can do is slow down. Thinking requires time, uninterrupted, quiet, uncomfortable time. The mind cannot analyze when it is simply reacting. It can't evaluate when it is constantly stimulated. It cannot create when it is constantly distracted. To begin climbing the pyramid, you must reclaim attention as a discipline. Start with the small things. Read something long enough for your mind to wander, and then force it back. Sit with an idea for more than 10 seconds. Resist the urge to jump between apps and tabs. Delay reactions by even a single breath. Because thinking begins where impulsivity ends. When you slow your mind, you create the space necessary for thought to grow. Higher order thinking is not a flash of genius. It's a habit. It requires endurance, not brilliance. Just as physical stamina builds through repeated exertion, mental stamina builds through repeated struggle. To grow it, you must intentionally engage with thoughts that stretch you. Choose books that challenge your worldview. Study ideas that you don't immediately understand. Sit with complex problems instead of rushing for the answer. Resist the temptation of simpler narratives. Each time you try to understand something different, you strengthen the very muscles necessary to climb. Most people stop thinking when they feel that friction. The climber rises because of the friction. Step 3. Learn to hold multiple possibilities at once. Low-level thinkers crave certainty. One explanation, one narrative, one tribe. But higher cognition begins the moment you realize that multiple truths can coexist and you can hold them in tandem. To analyze effectively, you must learn to hold contradictions without collapsing, compare ideas without choosing sides prematurely, tolerate ambiguity without panic, see the complexity inside simplicity. If level 1 thinking is a straight line, levels 4 through 6 are like a constellation. Your mind becomes capable of holding patterns that intertwine, overlap, and sometimes even conflict. And this is how depth emerges. Step 4. Build intellectual humility. The greatest enemy of thinking is the illusion that you already know enough. True thinkers have a unique trait that imitators lack: a quiet awareness of how little they truly understand. Like the great Socrates once said, "The only thing I know for sure is that I know nothing." Humility is the gatekeeper to the highest levels of thinking. Without it, the mind becomes a fortress, impenetrable, unchanging, defensive. To develop intellectual humility, assume your first reaction is incomplete. Question where your beliefs came from. Recognize that certainty is often a feeling, not a fact. Learn to say, "I don't know, but I want to know." Step 5. Begin judging what matters. At level 5, thinking becomes intentional. You're no longer comparing ideas just to compare them, you are drawing conclusions. You're shaping a worldview based on values, logic, evidence, context, trade-offs. And this is where most people tend to turn back. Why? Because evaluation requires commitment. It requires taking responsibility for your conclusions. It requires choosing what to prioritize, what to reject, what to protect, and what to release. But the moment you begin evaluating, truly evaluating, you step into adulthood of the mind, and the climber reaches the final ascent. Step 6. Create something new. Creation is not just artistic, it's cognitive. It is the moment when all the thinking you've done transforms into something original, a new interpretation, a new solution, a new model, a new synthesis, a new question, a new way of seeing the world. Creation is the ultimate expression of independence. It proves that you are no longer repeating the minds that came before you. You've built your own. This is the summit of the pyramid, not because it is the easiest, but because it is the furthest from imitation. People imagine the cognitive pyramid like a staircase, with some people stuck at the bottom and others lounging comfortably at the top. But this metaphor misses something important. The top is not a place, it's a practice. Nobody reaches it and stays there permanently. Nobody is done climbing. You rise, you fall, you rise again. Some days you live at level 6. Some days you regress to level 1. Every moment you choose depth over speed, curiosity over certainty, reflection over reaction, you ascend. Every moment you choose to ask one more question, consider one more angle, or sit with one more discomfort, you ascend. Every moment you choose to think for yourself, you ascend. And the miracle is this: when one mind climbs, it changes more than just that mind. It changes everyone connected to it. Your clarity becomes a light, guiding others to the top. In a world trapped at the bottom, climbing is a revolutionary act. The highest level of thinking is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's not about knowing the most facts or having the most opinions. It's not about winning arguments or dominating debates. The highest level of thinking is this: to be able to hold your mind in your hands, examine it with honesty, reshape it with intention, and create from it a life that is truly your own. There was once a young woman named Cassandra, said to be so beautiful that even the gods couldn't look away. Apollo himself fell in love with her. Some stories say that he desired her. Others say that he wanted her devotion. Either way, he made her an offer that no mortal could refuse. He granted her the gift of prophecy. Like many deep thinkers today, Cassandra could sense what was coming long before anyone else around her noticed. She didn't just react to events, she recognized patterns forming beneath the surface, consequences before causes, endings before beginnings. She saw disasters before they unfolded, betrayals hidden behind smiles, then predicted the fall of an entire civilization while its leaders laughed at her and called her insane. But Cassandra refused Apollo, and gods do not take rejection lightly. Unable to take back the gift he had already given her, Apollo twisted it instead. He cursed Cassandra so that always she would see the future and tell everyone about it, but no one would ever believe her. Her visions would be perfect, but her warnings would always be ignored. She would watch reality march towards catastrophe, knowing there was nothing she could do about it but get lost in her deepest, darkest thoughts. To know more than others can often feel like a blessing and a curse, a gift and a burden. You notice patterns that others overlook. You recognize problems long before they're acknowledged. Yet slowly and quietly, your mind gets crushed under the weight of truths it has no way to resolve. Are all deep thinkers doomed to Cassandra's fate? Or is there a way to defeat the god Apollo and learn to carry that awareness without letting it destroy you? This is the depressing psychology of deep thinkers. Life, before it is understood, it's meant to be lived. At its core, it's not just a theory to be solved, but an experience to be had. When a child learns to walk, it doesn't consult philosophy, it doesn't need Nietzsche to say its first words. It stumbles, and it falls. It scrapes its knee and cries, then stands back up and tries again. That is existence in its rawest form. Trial, error, and then motion. But as we grow older, something in us changes. Experience alone no longer feels sufficient. Awareness begins to look like the answer. If you want good grades, well, you have to study. If you pause before you speak, you communicate more clearly. If you plan ahead, you avoid mistakes. Slowly, thinking starts to feel like a shortcut, a cheat code for life itself. And for a while, everything's gravy. Preparation brings success. Insight brings control. Awareness sharpens the world into something that's easier to navigate. But eventually, you cross a threshold. A point where thinking no longer supports experience and begins to replace it entirely. Friedrich Nietzsche once suggested that profound pain creates depth. Like the child learning to walk, each fall teaches the value of balance. Each mistake carries information that no amount of abstraction or thinking could replace. Some lessons cannot be reasoned into existence. They must be felt through experience. Still, the deeply introspective mind resists that idea. If thinking helps a little, why wouldn't thinking help even more? Why risk the chaos of lived experience when you can simulate every outcome safely in your head? And a lot of people follow this path. I sometimes do too. And we all run into the same problem, and it's called metacognition. Quote, "A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts, so he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions." End quote. That was Alan Watts. At first, thinking does feel like an upgrade. You're no longer just thinking, you're thinking about your thinking, observing yourself observing, watching patterns as they form, and it creates this heady rush of clarity, a sense of intellectual elevation. Like Cassandra, seeing the future while others remain asleep. But it has a cost. And there are two kinds of thinking. There's reflection and rumination. Reflection moves towards a resolution, while rumination loops without an end goal. Unfortunately, most deep thinkers end up in rumination, and I know I'm guilty of that a lot too. They think about why they think about the way they think, dissecting the origin of every thought, every feeling, every impulse, tracing every emotion back to its psychological root. And at first it feels liberating, but eventually, seeing the future without being able to actually do anything about it becomes a trap, because there is no satisfying resolution and it's just a constant stream of sadness. So imagine someone who spent their entire childhood being obedient. When they finally break free of that mold, they naturally turn inward, examining every habit and tendency. Take people pleasers, for example. If they notice this pattern, acts of course correction will feel satisfying. But eventually that becomes an urge that they don't control. An awkward moment spent holding the door open for just a second too long for a stranger might ruin their night with constant replays of why they shouldn't have or what they could have changed. And here's the thing about awareness. It becomes dangerously harmful when there's no off switch. The mind develops its own second layer that watches the first layer, and eventually it's in an endless loop where neither layer rests. And that's how you're up at night, replaying every awkward silence or every social faux pas. This behavior is also called recursive thinking, and it explains why self-awareness tends to spiral instead of becoming a road to self-stabilization. There's a reason this spiral doesn't feel like a problem at first. Insight feels good. When the mind finally connects scattered pieces of information, there is a quiet surge of relief, an aha moment. The sudden sense that the chaos has been tamed and something hidden has been brought into the light, and more importantly, it's you that did that. For a brief moment, the world makes sense. Your brain rewards this heavily, because it doesn't distinguish between solving a real-world problem and solving a conceptual one. Both of those actions release the same physiological response. To the mind, insight is progress, even if nothing in your actual life has changed. And this is where deep thinkers get stuck. Psychology recognizes this tendency through a network in the brain called the default mode network, or DMN. It's mostly active when you're resting, daydreaming, or you're not really focused on the outside world. Think back to school. That late afternoon class where, sure, your body was present, but your teacher is just blabbing on and your mind has already drifted somewhere else. Well, that is your DMN taking over. For most people, the DMN happens only at certain times and with the right triggers. For deep thinkers, it does not shut up. An overactive DMN keeps attention completely focused inward. You start experiencing psychological threats even when there is no physical danger. You feel anxious without knowing why, sad without a clear cause. You're on edge in moments that are completely neutral. Evolutionarily, this system, it made sense. It's there for a reason, after all. After a close call, reflection helps us survive and avoid situations just like that. If our ancestors weren't able to learn from our mistakes, well, I can probably venture that we wouldn't be here discussing this. But the modern mind has turned this survival mechanism into a self-sustaining loop, and at the center of that loop is insight. Each realization feels like you're getting closer to peace, closer to clarity, closer to finally understanding yourself well enough to rest. But if you're watching this, odds are you know this as well, that rest never comes. The next question arrives, another pattern emerges, and another layer reveals itself. Like a crow obsessively solving puzzles for treats, the mind keeps chasing that reward of insight, and there's nothing left to gain after a certain point. You can spend years dissecting your childhood, your attachment style, your trauma, your thought patterns. You can map your entire inner world with stunning precision, and still, odds are you will have taken no meaningful steps forward. This is the quiet danger of insight addiction. Thinking becomes a substitute for action. Understanding replaces movement. The mind convinces itself that it's working hard while everything else remains on hold. In the palm of your hand, right now, is access to more self-help content than you could ever consume in 1,000 lifetimes. All of them, with different theories and explanations as to why you're the way you are and how you can become who you want to be. I'll come clean. Even on this channel, we often reflect on why our minds form certain thoughts. Some of you might have complicated childhoods filled with buried memories. Memories that likely ignited your journey into philosophy, leading you to explore the why of everything. As if at some point, the human condition will make enough sense for your mind to finally quiet down and rest. I'll let you know when that happens for me. It's not going to. The unspoken truth is that asking often creates the same roadblock preventing you from doing. In questioning the walls surrounding you, you're building yourself a prison. For deep thinkers, the present moment becomes secondary to their overly excited imagination. The worst part is that the mind, well, it's technically not wrong. Awkward moments really are tricky. They require thought. But that doesn't mean that they are worthy of hijacking your every waking moment. Spare yourself the pain. It's even fair to say that in those moments, you're really not thinking deeply. Instead, it's your DMN refusing to disengage. Most people naturally filter out irrelevant information. It's what helps them reach a specific kind of moment, the one where life feels like you're a butterfly flapping its wings, feeling every beat of tension in the air. It's the flow state, and if you've ever been there, it's beautiful. If there's one downside to the endless pondering of an overactive mind, it's you lose the ability to enter this flow state. Flow isn't just about focus, it's temporary ego death. Joy in flow doesn't come from feeling hyped up about what you're currently doing. Paradoxically, it emerges from an absence of self. In that moment, you disappear, and yet you're happy. Maybe not happy in smiles or celebrations, but you're happy in self-assuredness, the kind that doesn't need to question its own existence. To achieve this ethereal sensation, you must find immersion in the present moment. Unfortunately, deep thinkers struggle to let go of self-observation. Just as you're about to feel a moment, you stumble. Self-consciousness kicks in and it just spoils the magic. Have you ever watched a sports game and seen an athlete completely break down? Yeah, maybe it's a heckler in the crowd or a referee calls an unfair foul. Suddenly, their game becomes inconsistent. It's like their limbs are noodles and they can't seem to control anything anymore. They call it the yips in the industry. What do you think's wrong with the athlete? Well, it's a loss of flow. In the quest for a fulfilling life, a part of you needs to trust yourself enough to stop holding on. Now, I can't quite say what it is that you, as an individual, you watching this, need to let go of. For some, it's the lucky bracelet that they lost 2 weeks ago. For others, it's words like, "You're not good enough." Whatever it is, the real ability to get back in the game of life lies in you and only in you. To understand a deep thinker, we don't need to look at their intelligence. Instead, let's take a peek at their first world. You see, this mindset rarely begins as a choice, but rather as an adaptation. It originates as a brilliant, desperate strategy forged in a childhood where the ground was always shaky. Parents of introspective types were likely always in a mood. Well, not only that, their temperaments were the kind that could suddenly change like the weather in a random English town. Love or anger might have arrived with equal levels of intensity. In such an environment, hypervigilance is the most rational response you can have. The child learns to become a master observer, using their mind to map the subtle tremors preceding an eruption. Sometimes it's a change in tone, other times it's a loud kind of silence. Their safety depended on how well they could predict these shifts. In their worldview, they learn that life is safer when you simulate an action in your mind 100 times, constantly weighing every possible outcome instead of risking the unpredictable reaction of the real world. The mind then transforms into a sealed laboratory where all experiments are run over and over again. Another noteworthy trait from these types is spontaneity. Or should I say the lack thereof? Spontaneity is a luxury in the eyes of deep thinkers. It only exists for those who can trust their environment to catch them when they fall. For such a child, the only safe space is within the fortress of awareness. So feelings like joy can never be truly random. It's only allowed when they have a quiet, private relief and not a burst of celebration. There's an elitism often associated with the term deep thinker, and I think that's one that we could definitely do away with and replace with compassion. The traits that I've discussed in this video usually start off as badges of a superior intellect, but as these individuals go out into the vast, complicated society, they realize that the very strategy that once saved them is now the cage they have to learn to operate from the inside. To a decisive person, being wrong is only a minor setback. But as a deep thinker, it is more like existential despair. When you regularly provide nuanced insights, a single misstep doesn't just mean you got a fact wrong. It's more like your entire source of validation is wrong. Once shaken, it threatens to unravel your entire sense of credibility. If your value is solely the one who sees what others miss, then a public error is catastrophic. Like Cassandra, your worst fear is being called insane. And there is a second layer to this sentiment. When your identity is fused with the insight you can provide, speaking becomes a dangerous engagement. Your thoughts can't freely exist, and that makes you a much more wooden individual. When you've carefully constructed yourself around observation and understanding, the idea of having your thoughts ridiculed can keep you frozen away from any kind of authentic life. It's why criticism, even in passing, feels violently personal. As an ultimate consequence, the fear of being wrong isn't vanity. It's just a terrified mind constantly observing itself for flaws. Do you remember that scene in The Matrix where Neo is offered either the blue pill or the red pill? Life often draws parallels to that moment. In our modern world, the red pill is championed as an insight into the true nature of reality. It's seeing the code of the Matrix. As a deep thinker, life's illusions are dispelled. You learn everything about everything, the 48 laws of power, how to win friends and influence people. It's like your mind notices hidden strings of power dynamics, marketing psychology, and cognitive biases. Given such knowledge, the red pill, well, Seems like a no-brainer. After all, you've truly opened your eyes and seen the world for what it really is. Romance, well, that's just a series of hormonal transactions and attachment patterns. A career morphs into a ladder of incentives and status signals. You become a spectator, narrating your own anxieties with clinical terms as you feel them. This is where most modern deep thinkers get stuck. Analysis paralysis rapidly creeps in, teaching your brain that it's safer to analyze the game than to play it. If you only took the red pill to spend a lifetime pointing out flaws in the code, you were probably better off without it. Sociologist Max Weber called this disenchantment, that moment when explanation replaces wonder and the world starts to feel hollow. Here's what people often forget about the Matrix when they make the comparison between the blue pill and the red pill. Neo's purpose wasn't just to see the code around him. The movie didn't end when he started to see the code. His real lesson was about reintegrating the self within the code. So, like Neo, us deep thinkers, we have a task. We have to become the one. But how did Neo know he was the one? By committing a ridiculous act of bravery in the face of undefiable logic. He put his hand out and he stopped bullets in midair. It was an act of pure, unmediated self-belief within that system. In our reality, becoming the one is when you can walk through a crowded street without seeing the code at all. There's a profound joy in re-immersing yourself in the human experience while wielding the power to bend the rules. It's when you can feel love as magic again, even when you're aware of the biology that is driving it. Unfortunately, for deep thinkers, this burden doesn't stop in their minds alone. They also happen to emotionally simulate other people's problems. How this plays out is not a choice that's being made, it's more like a compulsion. So when a regular person might see a rude cashier, they'll come up with unnecessarily deep backstories like, that cashier has a second job or a sick parent. And just from these assumptions, they simulate emotions like stress, exhaustion, and despair. In a way, it even makes introspective individuals lose a fundamental edge that we need for survival. When someone cuts you off in traffic, they aren't a jerk anymore, and that can be dangerous, especially if the wrong person gets wind of what's going on. While hate is never something worth encouraging, it's also harmful to live in a constant state of understanding. Hate requires simplicity, while understanding breeds complexity. You don't need everyone around you to be complex. That burden ruins your mind in ways you never really get to perceive until it's too late. You see, there's an ambient pain that exists when empathy stretches too thin. It becomes harder to consume news, art, or even casual conversations without carrying some emotional residue. A funny video of an awkward dog can quickly turn into sad thoughts about how the dog can't make friends. Jesus. I've been there. A documentary isn't just informative anymore, it becomes an immersive, draining experience, especially in those demanding times. There's always a cause to speak for, a donation to make. You might lose sleep for not donating $1, even when you genuinely don't have much to give. It's a solemn existence where the world's pain has no off switch for you. While other people possess the ability to compartmentalize, the deep thinker's empathy bleeds through the walls. It's not like you don't have any boundaries, it's more like you feel guilty for establishing them in the first place. Setting boundaries feels like a moral failure. Telling people no might not be a simple one-sided experience. Remember that tendency to simulate emotions in other people? Well, that kicks in. So every hypothetical no creates a version of the other person's disappointment in your head, with you accepting it as reality. Ironically, the depth of feeling so much creates isolation. All this empathy doesn't bring you closer to anyone. In fact, when you express nuanced, sympathetic reasons behind a harmful person's actions, you might sound like you're excusing bad behavior. On top of that, as a person who generates endless compassion for other people's inner worlds, you most likely have none left to spare for yourself. Your own needs might seem simple, trivial, or selfish, next to the vast structures of simulated suffering around you. You become an emotional lighthouse, dutifully guiding others while standing alone in the cold yourself. So, what does it mean if that sounds like you? It certainly doesn't mean that you should flip the switch and become awful to the world. I don't think anyone has arrived at that conclusion, but if you have, that's not it. It's important to dig deeper into what your behavior truly implies. Sometimes self-awareness isn't what it sounds like. It's more like a cop-out. That uncomfortable surveillance is rooted in a lack of trust, and let's explore how that manifests. Digging into your inner mindscape as a deep thinker is a lot like looking at your reflection. If you look too deeply, you might get lost in the reflection. Take it from those that have seen the worst of self-rumination. There's a healthy version of introspection, and that's the one where you constructively learn from mistakes through self-examination. It's a focused, intentional process that leads to a new perspective. And then we have pathological introspection, aka self-rumination. This dark version of introspection starts off authentic. Imagine a panopticon, those prisons where guards are able to observe all inmates from a central guard tower. Your mind is a lot like that when you're in self-surveillance mode. The ease of access to every part of yourself automatically makes you feel like peaking is productive. You don't have experiences anymore, you only watch yourself having the experiences. And this causes something deep within you to split, fracturing your mind into the actor and the critic. Choosing an outfit, expressing an opinion, cracking a joke, it all starts to feel like a scene taking place under the cold fluorescent lights of self-commentary. Emotions also take a back seat. This level of change is dangerous for your mental health. Grief, joy, anger, none of these flow anymore. And for the longest time, you feel either numb or confused. It's not like you're not aware of what you're feeling. When something sad happens, your mind tags it as sadness and then files it into a library of documented feelings. Yet, they will sit there, unaddressed. For a healthier mind, when you're sad, you just let yourself feel sad. But to the self-surveilling mind, it's all explained away. If you miss out on a job, you chuck it away as, I feel bad because I won't be able to afford rent. And that is a genuinely awful situation, by the way. Yet instead of going through the motions of panic or a search for comfort, you coldly compartmentalize while looking for alternative solutions. Sure, you got the diagnosis right, but the cure of pure unmediated feeling remains missed. There's a sort of unaware high horse that comes with being a deep thinker. You're probably watching this video and thinking, this guy's full of himself. It's a kind of pride that sinks into hubris faster than you can blink. In a twist of irony, your desperate pursuit to be authentic is the most performative act in the stage play of your life. You're not really checking if you're being true to yourself, you're only checking whether or not you're being true to a concept of yourself. As counterintuitive as it sounds, playing it safe 1,000% of the time doesn't make you better than the person who lives without guardrails. Your meta-performance is a denial of something fundamental in your humanity. Before you even make choices, you simulate an internal critique of every possible option. Well, if I choose this, what does it say about me? Action is frozen by an endless audit. It's the same soulless energy that reeks when you see a corporate social media account attempting to be relatable. Prior to anything, their marketing team highlights every possible risk associated with even the most casual messages. Memes like 6'7" require scrutiny on a corporate page before they're posted. We can tell, you can tell, the whole world can see it. Yet, they do it all the same. The self as you know it is not a fixed thing. It's a story that you've built from past data. With self-surveillance, you're locked in one story indefinitely. You start to perform the character of a self-aware person, but in reality, it's less person, more character. Inevitably, you'll never genuinely change because change breaks the narrative. Like we pointed out earlier, the feeling of constantly holding on is an unmistakable trait for deep thinkers. In many cases, it might signify a presence in depths of depression. The surveillance system, the panopticon, has prepared an itinerary for what your life looks like. Any deviation is dangerous for the narrative that you've created. In reality, many murder their own potential in exchange for novelty. Witnessing. Compared to surveillance, witnessing is present, and it's curious. Surveillance is a voice loudly telling you to not mess things up. Witnessing, on the other hand, is observing yourself without the judgment. The ultimate goal of witnessing is to forget the mirror. Freedom doesn't come from better self-analysis, that just makes things feel worse. So what if you became a person who could be so absorbed in life that the watcher within dissolves away, letting you live in your experiences authentically? Loneliness is a familiar feeling that creeps in stealthily, hijacking a mind exploring its own depths. There's a special kind of isolation that comes not just from being misunderstood in the present, but from belonging to a future that's yet to arrive. Intellectuals often live in this dislocation. Their minds are constantly remodeled around systems and trajectories, granting them a keen eye for tremors. Not natural disasters, though, more like cultural shifts long before they hit. It's when a person can articulate a coming societal need while everyone else is seeking out old solutions. And that's what's so sad. First you're mocked, then you're ignored, and finally you're copied. It's a feeling of whiplash that creates a profound distrust for yourself. In future instances, you become more wary about sharing what you see. Why speak? Why bother if the reward is to be exiled and then erased? This loneliness is the price of living with your mind in tomorrow's world, while your body is still firmly planted in today. To curb a lack of meaningful connections, deep thinkers strive to ignite meaning, yet it plays out like sparking a flame without gathering any wood for a fire. For them, the shallow layers of the mind feels like a costume. What do you mean, small talk? I don't do small talk. I'm not a small talk person. That feels like NPC behavior. It's all it is a few fake smiles, laughs, and conversations either party really doesn't care much about. But that's the deep thinker. The world is a lot less predictable and programmed than deep thinkers care to admit. There are people out there who genuinely enjoy the mild warmth of communication without commitment. There's a beautifully intimate level of tact in the mundane. To see another human being and say, "I see you," without needing to unravel their soul. Think of a provider, like a father who constantly engages with the needs of everyone around him. The pressure might be so bad he doesn't feel like a real person anymore, only a tool for everyone else's needs. He might not reject the burden, instead he sees it as a duty. When such a person is met with a random conversation about sports or the weather, there's a level of gratitude that he would appreciate. It's not talking about his problems, but there's still value in the ordinary, to be reminded that the world's simplicity hasn't abandoned him for the sake of his duties. Small talk, in such cases, is a reminder that he too is just another person moving through life's motions. This is what the deep thinker struggles to grasp instinctively. Their compulsion for meaning makes them poor students of the gentle, connective art. It's not that they only prefer deep conversations. Their minds are more primed for deep or drain. Shallow conversations drain them because they can't access the simpler forms of connection. Meanwhile, truly deep conversations are rare. This results in a haunting feeling where they are constantly out of sync. Sociologists point out that small talk isn't about information, it's about synchronization. It's a way for humans to signal safety before chasing depth. It's not that deep thinkers are alone, it's that they're rarely ever met. So with this perspective, it's become a lot clearer that introspective individuals are clashing with the isolation. The "people don't get me" narrative fizzles out when there's a misalignment with fundamental forms of human connection. Modern social dynamics reward key traits like certainty and charisma. Depth is often at the back of the line for many. We tell ourselves otherwise on paper, but the truth is that we seek depth only when other core traits are also aligned. Depth operates on a totally different clock. In a world that prioritizes dazzling moments and conviction, leading with depth doesn't only feel inefficient, in some cases it feels like a failure. Let's take a look at work meetings, for instance. In these, The decisive, shallow thinker has a higher tendency to speak first compared to a deep thinker. They offer clean and surefire solutions, cut costs, boost morale. And that gives the group momentum. The deep thinker in such situations is probably thinking about how these suggestions from the shallow thinker might play out, tracing the consequences and roadblocks that might arise. By the time they come up with a nuanced counter, the conversation has already moved on. Their insight now becomes an interruption. Speed is rewarded and caution becomes an obstruction. Think about virality on social media. How often is layered commentary a hot topic? Very rarely. To find content with depth, one actually has to work to seek it out. Algorithms thrive with simpler ideas. It's a reflection of where we are as a society. Certainty and the extreme spread like a wildfire. They are clean dopamine hits of righteous agreement and vindictive outrage. Living in this system breeds a specific kind of frustration, one that makes you ask, why can't they see what's so obvious? As you watch simpler ideas get credit, resentment grows and the isolation continues to deepen. Everything described so far in this video carries an inevitable consequence: depression. Not as a dramatic collapse, but as exhaustion. The quiet shutdown that follows a mind forced to run at full capacity without rest. A deep thinker's sudden depression is rarely a sudden storm. It arrives slowly. A gray tide of mental fatigue disguised as maturity, intelligence, or even self-control. You don't feel broken, you feel worn thin. Constant awareness is the first culprit. A 360-degree surveillance of life's hidden code. The brain is never in simple perception. It's always decoding, translating, extracting meaning, and once this becomes a habit, there is no off switch. Many computer scientists describe the brain as a supercomputer. Now, imagine one capable of hyper-realistic simulations running non-stop round the clock, not only processing reality, but interrogating it in real time. Now ask yourself, does this actually matter? Does this mean something? Is this important? Well, eventually, that computer is going to overheat. Your existence becomes an academic exercise, a thesis that you must constantly defend. Life loses its color, its looseness, its mistakes. Everything feels heavy, earned, audited. Add the emotional labor of excessive empathy and the system just begins to collapse further. You're not just processing your own emotions anymore. You are generating entire emotional worlds for everyone around you. You are simulating their stress, their fear, their disappointment. The human mind was never built for this kind of multiplex processing. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Clinically, it often shows up as numbness, an inability to feel pleasure, a dull mental fatigue that's easy to dismiss. Many believe depression requires a grand cause, a tragedy, a loss, but life's fatigue is wholly underestimated. And when you tell yourself you have no right to feel this way, well, that's when the guilt sets in. That guilt pushes you deeper into the very habits that cause the collapse. You become more aware of yourself, you analyze yourself more self-monitoring. So, where do you go from here? Well, if Cassandra teaches us anything, it's that the cure was never knowledge itself. It was living only as a witness, forever observing, forever warning, never participating. The escape isn't to defeat Apollo. It's to stop trying to outthink him. Grant yourself the meaningless pleasures, the unoptimized moments. Bypass the internal checks that you've installed. Say that dumb thing that's on your mind. Make that awkward move. Let yourself be wrong in public. Play the fool. Cassandra didn't suffer because she saw the future. She suffered because she couldn't have a hand in how her own future and that of those around her could play out. But you, my dear viewer, are different. Because unlike Cassandra, who could only tell others, you can act. You can make a change. If you recognized yourself in her story, the cure isn't to see less, but to understand that taking action, doing something that influences the future is far better than seeing it. We treat intelligence like it's some kind of miracle, an unseen force that's powerful enough to shape an entire life from behind the scenes. We assume that if you're intelligent enough, the world should bend more easily in your favor. You should be able to resolve problems faster, make better choices much easier, and you should have your entire life figured out before the first time any adult even gets the chance to ask, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" But this belief that intelligence is some form of protection from the hardships of life only exists because of survivor's guilt. We hear from the most successful, intelligent people and assume that that's the case for everyone, when in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. When we actually look at the neuroscience and psychology of highly intelligent people, we discover that, for the most part, it doesn't feel like protection at all, but actually overexposure. Instead of a world that's simplified, they're forced to live in a world that's hyper-fragmented and completely unstable. And all of this could lead to a pretty grim reality if left unchecked. This is the depressing psychology of people with extremely high intelligence. Part 1. The cognitive engine. The first mistake is to imagine a high level of intelligence as simply an upgrade, a faster version of the same operating system, a more efficient processing, quicker recall, better performance across familiar tasks. It isn't. The highly intelligent mind doesn't just process information more quickly, it processes it differently. The structure of thought and, in turn, behavior itself begins to shift. The mind stops acting like a tool and starts behaving like an engine that never turns off. Psychologists describe this as a need for cognition. However, I have a slight issue with the way the phrase is worded because need for cognition suggests that the person simply enjoys thinking more than others, when in reality it's much closer to a compulsion. A conversation isn't finished when the other person stops talking. The mind then takes that conversation and reconstructs it later, examining it from multiple angles, stripping it down into its components of tone, implication, and intent, all that semiotic goop. Every fragment of experience is replayed not for the memory's sake, but for analysis. And the consequence of this is a mind that never settles. You don't get any closure or any sort of proper conclusion. You are constantly thinking about the many branches of possibilities, the multiple interpretations of the same event, all of which can completely destabilize your own perception of reality. This process gets even worse when the mind begins to simulate the future. Neuroscience refers to this as prospective cognition, but again, I feel like the term hides the intensity of what is actually happening. The mind isn't simply predicting outcomes, it is constructing detailed internal simulations of them. Before a decision is made, multiple versions of the future are already being played out in the mind. Different actions, different reactions, different consequences. And hey, at first, this feels like a huge strategic advantage. It allows for foresight, planning, anticipation of risks before they even materialize. But within this advantage is a hidden flaw. Because the more futures the mind can generate, the harder it becomes to commit to a single one. It's the classic illusion of choice. When presented with way too many options, it becomes a lot more difficult to just pick one and stick to it. That's why you often see highly intelligent people that just cannot decide what they want to do with their life. Every waking moment, they can see all of the different possibilities of who they could become, and it just becomes so difficult to pick just one. And this actively works against them in a world that rewards specialization over generalization. Beyond the external consequences, you also get some internal issues too. Metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking, becomes a constant background process. So now you're not only generating thoughts, but you're also evaluating those same thoughts in real time. The mind splits into layers. One part produces ideas, another part observes them, and a third critiques. Just like prospective cognition, this feels like a great thing at first. It's a way to improve your accuracy and avoid errors, after all. But upon close inspection, when every thought is immediately subject to critique, your confidence completely shatters. Just like a child stops trying if you constantly tell them that they're not good enough, the part of your brain responsible for generating new ideas slowly dies out when it's constantly criticized. Only that this time, you're also the one doing the critiquing. This internal complexity is amplified by a structural difference in how the brain organizes attention. In most people, focused attention and spontaneous thought operate in opposition. When the mind concentrates, you stop daydreaming. When it wanders, structured reasoning quiets down. This alternation creates a very stable, comfortable rhythm. But in highly intelligent individuals, this boundary is weakened. The systems responsible for focused control and those responsible for abstract association begin to operate simultaneously. The result is not just more thought, but a different kind of thought entirely. While focusing on a specific task, the mind continues generating connections in the background. Ideas from unrelated domains begin to link together. Patterns emerge across contexts that were never meant to intersect. A simple problem becomes connected to a broader conceptual network. The individual is no longer solving the task in isolation. They are situating that task within a much larger and more complicated system. By this point, the pattern is clear. The highly intelligent mind is not simply more capable, it is more active, more recursive, more connected, and way more demanding. And this is only the cognitive layer. The system has not yet reached emotion. It hasn't reached sensation. It hasn't reached over to other people. Part 2. The emotional and sensory volume. If intelligence were only cognitive, its burden would remain contained. The problem would be structural, but manageable. A matter of thought patterns, decision-making, and internal complexity, something that could, at least in principle, be regulated. But of course, it does not stop there. Because the same system that processes reality more deeply also feels it more intensely. The first distortion appears in empathy. Empathy is usually understood as a moral quality, the ability to care about others, to recognize their emotional states, and to respond appropriately. But in highly intelligent individuals, empathy becomes less a choice and more of a perceptual condition, a mandatory operational parameter. It operates automatically. Signals that others barely register become almost impossible to ignore. Subtle shifts in tone, micro-expressions, pauses that carry meaning, contradictions between what has been said and what is implied. The mind constructs internal models of other people with the same precision it applies to abstract problems. It tracks emotional states, predicts reactions, infers hidden motives, and this creates an unusual advantage. And, if you've been paying any attention, it also creates quite a burden. Because perception doesn't just stop at recognition. The emotional state of another person doesn't remain external. It becomes internalized. The individual doesn't only understand what others feel, they also experience it, often involuntarily. This phrase, which I absolutely adore, is called emotional contagion. Pull that one out at a party. And it transforms empathy from a strength into a massive liability. The world becomes saturated with signals that just cannot be turned off. Imagine having the ability to read everyone's mind in every room you could walk into. How difficult would that experience be? You enter into a room of 100 people and you can hear everything from everyone's minds all at once. It's a terrifying concept. So what do you do with that information overload? Well, you withdraw. You seek solitude out of necessity. It's a way of reducing input to a level that you can better manage without burning yourself out. But that withdrawal is frequently misinterpreted by others. It's seen as an antisocial behavior, as detachment or worse, disinterest. But I should clarify, it is none of these. It's the only way you know how to recover mentally and emotionally. This dual amplification of both emotion and imagination leads to a rather unique kind of psychological pressure, where you're capable of experiencing both good and bad extremes simultaneously. You can experience deep empathy along with extraordinary emotional fatigue, creative insight and anticipatory anxiety, sensory richness and sensory overload. Sometimes this can produce extraordinary depth in individuals, a capacity to feel, to understand and create in ways that are inaccessible to others. And this is the external part most people see when they talk about highly intelligent people. They see capability, creativity, and incredible insights. What they don't see, however, is the internal cost of sustaining that capacity, the continuous input, the emotional absorption, the inability to filter any of this, the persistent internal activity, the lack of mental quietness and clarity. The more I looked into the neuroscience behind all of this, the more interesting questions began to pop up in my own mind. Like, what happens when the mind not only detects patterns in reality, but also absorbs the emotional and sensory weight of those patterns in real time? The answer isn't immediately visible when you're on your own. But once you are in the middle of a social environment, it becomes painfully clear. Because other people are not neutral stimuli. They are very complex and unpredictable systems all of their own. And this is where the really big problems start to set in. Part 3. The social burden and isolation. Up to this point, the system has remained internal. A cognitive engine that does not shut down, an emotional field that can't be filtered, a sensory system that absorbs more than it can comfortably process. These pressures are significant, yes, but the saving grace is at least they're still contained inside that person. But, unfortunately, none of us exist in a vacuum. And when the structure of one mind differs too sharply from the structure of the surrounding group, something subtle begins to fracture. The first fracture appears as a communication gap. Most social interaction operates on a compression algorithm. Ideas are simplified, language is streamlined. Complexity is reduced to maintain speed and cohesion in the conversation. And these conversations move quickly because they relied on shared and unspoken assumptions and incomplete explanations. Precision is sacrificed for flow and speed, and for the most part, that's a good thing. For the highly intelligent mind, however, this compression feels unnatural. Beneath every simplified statement, the omitted layers remain visible. Every generalization reveals its exceptions. Every conclusion reveals the assumptions. The individual hears not only what's said, but everything that has been left unsaid. This creates a subtle but persistent friction. Because the conversation being experienced internally isn't the same as the conversation being spoken externally. The individual is operating at a different level. And at first, sure, this all seems like a very minor inconvenience. It's just a slight misalignment in conversational styles. Fine, who cares? But When this is nearly every single conversation with almost everyone, you can start to see how exhausting it gets. You feel like every conversation is a performance rather than a true exchange of ideas and opinions. So, you start to mask. You're forced to compress your own thinking to match the environment, to maintain coherence within the group and avoid creating any unnecessary friction. And hey, you know what? The strategy works, but it comes with a cost. Because over time, the gap between internal experience and external expression begins to widen. You're no longer communicating what you actually think, but only a representation of what you think people can understand. And with that comes a specific kind of isolation. Not physical isolation, but a mental one, where you're surrounded by others, maybe even participating in shared activities, but your core thoughts and opinions remain unseen. In a way, it feels like you're giving up a part of yourself so you can properly function within the group. And that's just, well, sad. Beyond that, there's also the unfortunate reality that a lot of social systems rely on selective attention. You need to be able to overlook certain contradictions in order to preserve certain relationships, to tolerate certain inconsistencies because confronting them could destabilize the whole system. But the highly intelligent mind struggles to perform this filtering. It sees too much. And once something has been seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This produces what can only be described as the curse of awareness. Over time, you begin to perceive a persistent gap between surface-level reality and its underlying structures. Social norms appear less like truths and more like agreements. Institutions appear less like stable systems and more like negotiated constructs. Behavior appears less consistent and more context-dependent. The world doesn't become meaningless, but everything becomes conditional. And conditional systems are difficult to trust. This shift in perception introduces a new kind of tension because while the individual sees through certain structures, they are still required to participate within them. They must operate within systems that they no longer fully believe in. They have to follow rules that appear arbitrary, engage in interactions that feel partially constructed. The system doesn't allow for complete disengagement, and so the individual remains inside of it, aware of its limitations, and unable to fully reconcile with them. Then you have the fact that if you're intelligent and you're not shy to express it, some people can feel threatened by that. Psychologically, this can be understood as a form of the mirror effect. When people experience social or intellectual threat, the amygdala activates. The same system responsible for detecting danger begins to respond to perceived cognitive imbalances. The reaction is physiological in nature. The individual isn't rejected because they lack value. They are resisted because they introduce instability to the shared social ecosystem. And this dynamic has a historical precedent. Throughout history, individuals who pursued truth beyond the limits of social comfort have often been marginalized. Not because they were incorrect, but because they were inconvenient for the status quo. Socrates was executed for daring to question the whims of the state. Galileo was punished for contradicting the teachings of the church. Turing was persecuted for being too different. The pattern is consistent. Society doesn't resist intelligence itself. It resists when intelligence reveals an error in its current system. This distinction, in my opinion, is critical because it reframes the source of this isolation. The individual isn't isolated because they're incapable of connection. They're isolated because the conditions required for genuine connection are rare to come across, and they require depth, precision, tolerance for complexity, willingness to engage beyond simplified models. These conditions exist, but they're not common. And so the individual remains in a state of partial integration, connected but not fully understood, engaged but not fully expressive, present but not fully seen. At this point, the problem has expanded beyond cognition and perception. It's now become structural, because the system is operating across 3 layers simultaneously: continuous internal processing, amplified emotional and sensory input, and misaligned social interaction. And each of these layers introduces their own pressures, but together they produce something more complex. A form of internal tension that cannot be resolved through adjustment alone, because the problem is no longer internal. It's embedded in the way the system operates. And this is where the final layer begins to emerge, not as a new category, but as a convergence point, where cognition, emotion, and social experiences intersect and begin to turn inward. This is where intelligence stops being a trait and becomes a condition that shapes how existence itself is interpreted. This is where it all becomes existential. Part 4: The Existential Weights and Paradoxes. The first sign of this shift appears in decision-making. From the outside, intelligence is expected to produce decisiveness, the ability to analyze options, identify the optimal path, and act with confidence. The assumption is that more information leads to better choices. But this assumes that information converges to a single point. In the highly intelligent mind, it does not. Because every decision isn't just evaluated once, it's expanded into a network of possible outcomes. Each choice generates multiple trajectories, each trajectory branches into further consequences. The system isn't seeing one future, it sees many. And each one carries its own risks, trade-offs, and uncertainties. This creates a condition known as analysis paralysis. But I think that term is misleading. It suggests hesitation due to weakness, and this isn't the case at all. It's not weakness we're talking about. The system isn't failing to decide. It's overwhelmed by the number of decisions it can see simultaneously. Actions require reduction. It requires collapsing all of these possibilities into a single path. But the mind resists that collapse because it remains aware of everything that is being excluded in this process. To choose one is to ignore the alternative, and the highly intelligent mind isn't built to ignore things. This creates a second tension between imagination and reality. The same capacity that allows the individual to simulate multiple futures also allows them to construct ideal ones. These aren't vague aspirations, but they are detailed internal models of how something could be executed perfectly, whether it's a project, a career, or even a life path. The mind can see the optimal version with clarity, but reality doesn't operate at that level of precision. Execution always introduces noise and constraints and imperfection. Outcomes diverge from your intention, and the result rarely matches your internal model. And when the comparison is made, the difference isn't perceived as an acceptable variation. It's perceived as outright failure. This is called maladaptive perfectionism. The inability to tolerate any deviation from an internally constructed ideal. You're not measuring yourself against others. You're measuring yourself against an idealized, perfect erosion of reality that is impossible to replicate in the real world. And the consequence of this, as you can imagine, is chronic dissatisfaction. Over time, this dissatisfaction accumulates into cognitive exhaustion, or, as it's more commonly referred to, burnout. This internal pressure is compounded by a third paradox: the relationship between intelligence and self-perception. There's a widely observed phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Individuals with low ability tend to overestimate their competence, while individuals with high ability tend to underestimate theirs. The explanation is straightforward. The more you know, the more aware you become of what you don't know. But in the highly intelligent mind, this awareness doesn't just remain abstract, it becomes continuous. Every domain reveals its own depth. Every answer reveals further questions. The boundary of knowledge expands faster than the content within it. The individual isn't simply aware of gaps in their understanding, they are surrounded by them. This produces intellectual humility, which is a good thing. but it also produces structural self-doubt. You never believe you're correct, and you constantly assume your information is incomplete, and as such, every conclusion is provisional. Every belief then is subject to revision, and confidence is replaced by an ongoing verification process. And these three pressures, analysis saturation, perfectionism, and structural doubt, begin to then converge. The individual is highly capable but increasingly hesitant, highly insightful but increasingly dissatisfied, highly aware but increasingly uncertain. This destabilization reaches its most profound form when it turns towards existential questions. Because the highly intelligent mind does not remain confined to practical problems. It extends naturally into the realm of abstraction. Questions of meaning, purpose, mortality, and existence are constantly turned over and perused. And when they are pursued with the same level of intensity applied elsewhere, they don't resolve into comforting answers, they expand into ever more unsettling thoughts. Consider the concept of meaning. For most individuals, meaning is constructed through participation, and these are relationships, goals, routines. It's experienced rather than analyzed or dissected. Its structure is implicit and not examined in any great detail. But the highly intelligent mind interrogates it. What is meaning structurally? Is it inherent, or have we just constructed it? If it's constructed, by what mechanism did we construct it? If it's dependent on perception, does it persist independently of it? If meaning can be created, could it also be invalidated? These questions don't remain theoretical, they can start to affect a person's lived experience. Because once meaning is understood as contingent, it loses its automatic authority. Actions no longer feel inherently justified. Goals no longer feel self-evident. The individual becomes aware that the frameworks used to define purpose are themselves constructed. A similar process occurs with mortality. The awareness of death is universal, but for most people it remains abstract, distant, and manageable. It's acknowledged, yeah, but not continuously integrated into perception. For the highly intelligent mind, the inevitability of death is not a distant idea. It is a constant boundary condition. Every action is framed within it. Every plan exists within a finite horizon. The individual is not simply aware that life ends, they are aware of how that ending shapes everything before it. This awareness produces a certain difficult weight that humans are simply not evolved to carry. And as a result, over time, these abstract pressures accumulate into what can be described as existential depression. And not depression in the clinical sense of dysfunction, but in the structural sense of disillusionment. The individual begins to perceive a gap between the scale of the questions that they're confronting and the scale of the activities they are expected to perform from day to day. Because daily life continues. Tasks have to be completed. You have to brush your teeth. Responsibilities must be fulfilled, systems navigated. But these activities begin to feel disconnected from the underlying questions that occupy the mind. The individual is operating on two levels simultaneously, one practical and one existential, and that distance between them grows. This creates a final paradox. The system that produces the deepest understanding of reality also produces the greatest difficulty in participating within it. The structures that give life coherence, meaning, purpose, identity are seen as constructs rather than foundations. They still function, oh sure, but they don't feel absolute. And functioning without absolutes requires constant reconstruction, which creates even more mental strain. At this point, the transformation is complete. Intelligence is no longer a trait that improves performance within the system. It is a condition that changes how the system itself is perceived. And all of this leads to a final question. If intelligence removes the illusions that make life feel stable, what remains then? What replaces certainty when certainty dissolves? What replaces inherited meaning when meaning becomes visible as a construction? What does the system do when it can no longer rely on the assumptions that once supported it? Well, I have to be honest, we don't have an answer to these questions. All you can do is find a way to adapt, to live within a world that no longer feels complete. Because the system cannot return to its previous state, you just have to learn to operate within it. Part 5. Navigating the Gift. The first adaptation requires a reversal of how effort itself is managed. Most people organize their lives around time. Hours are allocated to different activities using schedules, and productivity is measured by how much time each of these activities take and what you can accomplish within them. The assumption is that consistency produces results, that showing up repeatedly and predictably is sufficient. But this model doesn't map cleanly onto a system that operates on intensity rather than continuity. The highly intelligent mind doesn't produce output in a linear fashion. It doesn't engage evenly across all tasks. It activates selectively in response to complexity, novelty, and pressure. There are periods of apparent inactivity followed by periods of extreme focus and disproportionate output. From the outside, this appears inconsistent. From the inside, it's just efficient. The mistake is trying to force a version of consistency into a system that won't support it. Instead of trying to manage time, manage energy. Identify the conditions under which your mind activates and operates at full capacity. Protect those conditions and then structure your environment to allow deep engagement when it naturally comes to you, rather than forcing yourself to have all these shallow thoughts just to fill the time. This is known to a lot of people as getting into a flow state, the moment where work stops feeling like work and everything just, it clicks. In the flow state, multiple systems that are usually in tension begin to align. Attention narrows, but not too rigidly. It becomes precise without becoming brittle. The background noise of unrelated thoughts recedes because the mind is synchronized around a single trajectory. The recursive loops that normally fragment attention collapse into forward motion. But this state isn't randomly accessible. It can only happen when the difficulty of the task is precisely matched to the capability of the mind. If it's too simple, the mind disengages. Too complex, and it fragments. Flow exists at that perfect threshold, the point where the task is demanding enough to require full attention, but easy enough to allow progress. And it is a very, very narrow window. And more importantly, you cannot force it. This is where the earlier mistake becomes clear. Trying to produce flow through discipline alone is ineffective because discipline operates on time, not on conditions. It assumes that sustained effort will eventually produce engagement. But for a system that requires alignment, effort without the right conditions produces resistance, not immersion. You can sit at a desk for hours and never enter flow, but by designing the right systems, you might even be able to enter it on command, which is very neat. One of those systems is embracing solitude. This leads to a second, more difficult adjustment, the re-evaluation of solitude. In most social frameworks, solitude is often framed as a deficit rather than a necessity. But for a mind that is continuously processing, continuously absorbing and evaluating, solitude can serve a different function. It's not simply being antisocial, it is a necessary decompression that the brain needs to keep functioning optimally. Without these periods of reduced input, the system accumulates noise, things like emotional residue, unprocessed sensory data, unending cognitive loops. Solitude stops this pattern and creates a space for the mind to just relax and rejuvenate. By thinking of solitude through this new lens, you stop thinking of your own need as a dysfunction, and you start embracing a healthy coping mechanism for your own mind. But, as always, there is a need for balance. Taking regular moments of solitude doesn't mean that you can completely cut people out of your life and go live as a hermit in the woods. Far from it. In fact, this leads us perfectly to the third adaptation to help cope with your mind, and that's actually to avoid isolation. Yep, just follow me on this. I just talked about solitude, but regulated solitude is totally different from prolonged periods of isolation. Solitude is a healthy way to recharge. The other way is a fast way to lose your mind from loneliness. And while yes, I am talking about physical isolation, I'm talking about more than that. I think the more pressing issue is mental isolation. That feeling that no one can understand you, the gap between the internal complexity of your mind and what you're able to express to those around you. And I'll be honest, the sad truth is that this gap can't be eliminated entirely, but it can be reduced a lot by changing your environment. Understanding that you don't need to be friends with everyone. You just need a few people who are operating at a compatible level of depth, people who are capable of engaging with the complexity that you have to share without you needing to collapse it for mass consumption. These connections are wonderful and they are, sadly, rare. But they are not non-existent. They are out there. And when they do happen, they breathe such a breath of fresh air into your life that everything starts to feel better. You stop feeling the need to mask your true thoughts. You stop feeling the need to compress yourself. You can express your true self without reduction. And this produces something that had previously been unstable: resonance. Resonance doesn't eliminate the underlying complexity. It doesn't resolve the recursive thinking, the emotional intensity, the structural doubt, but it redistributes the weight and makes it a lot easier for you to carry. The idea of intelligence as a simple advantage has been dismantled. The model of ease has been replaced by a model of exposure. The assumption of clarity has been replaced by a recognition of complexity. It's a lot more difficult to hear, sure, but it's also more accurate. And accuracy carries a cost. It removes illusions before they're incomplete. They compress reality into forms that are easier to navigate. They provide stability by reducing complexity. They allow the system to function without confronting every single contradiction. But intelligence expands those contradictions by making the invisible structures visible. This is the final inversion. The problem isn't that intelligence isolates you from reality. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The problem is that it brings you much closer to it. The world that feels stable to others feels conditional to you. And within that condition, a choice emerges for you. Not a choice about whether you're intelligent or not, that's fixed, but a choice about how your intelligence is used. Whether the system continues to operate as a closed loop, generating complexity without resolution, or whether it begins to construct frameworks that can support that complexity without collapsing under it. There is no return to simplicity. You can only move forward towards understanding and resolution, towards building structures that can hold what the mind reveals without denying it, towards creating meaning that is consciously constructed rather than unconsciously inherited, toward engaging with reality not as something fixed but as something interpreted. And in the end, the final realization isn't comforting, sorry, but it is precise. Intelligence won't give you a clearer world, but it will give you a more honest one. And honesty, once seen, can't be unseen. If you feel seen or understood by this video, then you'd also love our video on the psychology of deep thinkers and how you can break free from the curse of Cassandra. Click the video showing right now to continue watching. The story of the gifted child rarely begins with pressure or burnout. It almost always begins, quite the opposite actually, with ease. Early on, something becomes clear to the adults around them. This child learns faster. They grasp concepts intuitively. They only need to be given the dots and they figure out how to connect them. While other children struggle through repetition, confusion, and trial and error, the gifted child often understands things the first time they encounter them. And because school rewards outcomes rather than the process, this difference is immediately reinforced. The child gets good grades without studying. They finish assignments faster than everyone else. Teachers praise them, not for persistence or discipline, but for their innate intelligence. Parents describe them as naturally smart. Peers notice the difference. Slowly, subtly, intelligence stops being something the child does and starts becoming something that they are. This sounds amazing in theory, but if the title of this video is anything to go by, this ease, unfortunately, doesn't last forever. The gifted child becomes the former gifted child, a regular adult, burdened with pressure and struggling with burnout. Why does this happen? If you're a gifted adult, what can you do about it? And if you have gifted kids around you, how can you protect them from this? This is the psychology of the former gifted child. From a cognitive perspective, the human brain is an efficient machine. Its primary function is not truth, growth, or self-actualization, it's energy conservation. The brain constantly seeks the least metabolically expensive way to reach an outcome. In other words, the shortest path between problem and solution. When a child repeatedly succeeds without effort, their brain learns a very simple rule. Effort is unnecessary. This creates an adaptation that tells the brain that if raw intellect alone produces rewards, then hard work is simply metabolic waste. Practice feels wasteful. Repetition feels insulting. Why grind when intuition is always faster? Why struggle when understanding comes to you automatically? Over time, the gifted child's brain becomes exceptionally good at bypassing difficulty altogether. It learns how to skip steps. In psychology, skill acquisition depends on gradual exposure to challenge. Most children climb difficulty incrementally. They struggle early, fail often, and slowly build tolerance for confusion, frustration, and sustained effort. They learn how to learn. The gifted child, however, is often exempt from this process. They skip the tutorial. They jump ahead before the foundational habits ever really form. As a result, something critical never develops: habituated effort. The gifted child does not build study rituals because they don't need them. They don't develop persistence because success arrives without resistance. They don't learn how to sit with not knowing because confusion rarely lasts long enough to test their endurance. From the outside, this looks like exceptional ability. From the inside, it creates a fragile cognitive ecosystem that depends entirely on things remaining easy. And school does nothing to correct this. In fact, it accelerates it. Educational systems are designed in a way where gifted children are rarely challenged appropriately, and when they are bored, that boredom is interpreted as proof of superiority rather than a signal of unmet developmental needs. Over time, the child internalizes a very dangerous lesson that struggle is abnormal. This lesson spreads from their academic life and becomes a part of their identity. Praise plays a central role here as well. When children are praised for effort, they learn that success is something they build. When they are praised for intelligence, they learn that success is something they must protect. "You're so smart," someone saying that, feels encouraging, but psychologically it creates a fixed reference point. Intelligence becomes a trait that must be defended rather than a capacity that can be exercised. The child begins to understand implicitly that being smart means not trying too hard. If something requires visible effort, it threatens that image of intelligence, so they try their best to shy away from effort, from struggle, from failure. Psychologically, this creates what many former gifted children later describe as paralysis. They want to do meaningful things, but only if success is guaranteed. The ego frames every challenge as a coin flip. If I try and fail, I lose my claim to my identity. If I don't try, well, at least the possibility of being exceptional remains intact. This is why a lot of gifted kids struggle with a crippling fear of failure that prevents them from ever trying something they're not 100% sure would work, even though in the real world some sort of risk is almost always required for success. Instead, they stick to the safest option, which is, well, inaction. This avoidance pattern is often misinterpreted as arrogance or entitlement. In reality, it's a defense mechanism. The gifted child is protecting the only version of themselves that has ever been validated. Trying and failing, it doesn't just hurt, it threatens the total of annihilation of their self-concept. And all of this remains totally invisible as long as the environment stays forgiving. But eventually, the child reaches a point where raw intellect is no longer enough. This moment is often described by former gifted adults as hitting the wall. It might happen in higher education, in a demanding career, or simply in adult life where complexity, ambiguity, and long-term effort are totally unavoidable. For the first time, understanding does not come instantly. For the first time, success requires sustained, uncomfortable effort. And the problem isn't that the task is hard. The problem is that the gifted child never learned how to be bad at something and keep going. They never learned the art of getting good. Where others experience a gradual learning curve, the gifted individual experiences a sudden collapse. There's no ramp up, no adjustment period, no tolerance for their own imperfections. The system goes from effortless success to a complete and total breakdown. And because their identity was never built around effort, they have nothing to fall back on. What follows is often interpreted as burnout, laziness, or wasted potential, but psychologically, it is something else entirely. It is the consequence of an efficiency-optimized mind that was never taught how to struggle. If the gifted child's early life is defined by ease, their adulthood is often defined by expectation. From a young age, gifted children are surrounded by a particular narrative. Teachers predict great futures. Parents speak in terms of what they will become. Potential becomes the central theme of their identity long before they even fully understand what any of it means. And potential, unlike ability, does not live in the present. It lives in the future. Psychologically, this creates a subtle but powerful distortion. The gifted child is not evaluated for who they are or what they've built. They're evaluated for what they're supposed to become. Their value is deferred. Their worth exists in a hypothetical version of themselves that has not yet arrived. Think about it like building a mansion. Society hands the gifted child a blueprint for a mansion, and it's not a small one, but a grand one. Something impressive, complex, and rare. Meanwhile, their peers are given blueprints for modest shacks, simple structures, manageable projects. Ones that can be completed step by step over time with ordinary effort. The problem is not that the mansion is better. The problem is that building a mansion takes far longer, far more planning, and far more tolerance for unfinished work. As children, this difference doesn't matter. Everyone is still laying foundations. But adulthood changes the timeline. At some point, people begin to compare outcomes rather than plans, and this is where the gifted individual begins to suffer. They look around and see their peers living inside completed structures, careers, families, routines, and stability. Though they may not be glamorous, they are real. They exist. Meanwhile, the gifted adult looks at their own project and sees only an incomplete foundation, half-built walls, abandoned plans, endless revisions. They see a potential that has never been actualized. And psychologically, this feels like failure. Even if the gifted person has worked harder than others, even if they've explored more ideas, taken more risks, or thought more deeply, none of that matters if the structure isn't finished. Potential does not count as shelter. Intention does not count as completion. This creates a unique form of shame. Not the shame of being incapable, but the shame of not living up to what was promised. The gifted adult is haunted not by who they are, but by who they could have been. Every choice feels like a deviation from their larger-than-life potential. Every unfinished project feels like evidence of their ordinariness. Every ordinary outcome feels like a betrayal of the blueprint. In this way, potential becomes a curse rather than a gift. Instead of motivating action, it creates paralysis. The standards are so high, the imagined future so grand that any real-world step feels simply insufficient. Why build something small when you were meant to build something extraordinary after all? Why settle for a shack when you were promised a mansion? This dynamic is intensified by comparison. Gifted individuals are often acutely aware of trajectories. They notice where others are in their lives. They measure themselves against their peers, not in terms of happiness or meaning, but in terms of progress towards some imagined ideal. And because their ideal is larger and more abstract, it is always further away. The result is a constant sense of being behind, even when objectively, they're not. Psychologically, this produces what can be described as temporal shame. Shame not about the present moment, but about time itself. Years feel wasted, decisions feel irreversible, the future feels like it's closing in rather than opening up. And because this shame is tied to identity and not behavior, it becomes very difficult to address. You can fix a mistake, you can change a habit, but how? How do you escape a version of yourself that exists only in your own imagination? Many former gifted children respond to this by disengaging entirely. Well, if that mansion can never be properly built, why try to build it at all? Others cling to potential as a form of psychological comfort. As long as the mansion remains hypothetical, it can't be judged. The dream stays intact as long as it is never tested against reality. This leads to a strange inversion. Actual achievement becomes threatening because it collapses the fantasy into something finite. To complete something is to admit it is smaller than what was imagined, and so the gifted adult oscillates between grand visions and complete inaction, trapped between ego and fear. At the same time, there's another layer to this psychology that often goes unnoticed. Giftedness is rarely evenly distributed across development. High intellectual ability frequently comes with asynchronous growth. A child may be cognitively advanced, but emotionally underdeveloped. They may understand complex concepts long before they can regulate their emotional feelings. They may think abstractly while still responding to the world with the emotional sensitivity of a much younger child. This mismatch creates internal chaos. Because the child appears mature intellectually, their emotional needs are often overlooked. Adults assume capability in one domain implies capability in all others, but it doesn't. Emotional regulation, frustration tolerance, and social resilience develop through experience, not intelligence. And when those experiences are avoided or misunderstood, development stalls. Many gifted children learn to intellectualize their emotions instead of feeling them. They develop what psychologists call cognitive empathy. They can analyze emotions, explain them, predict them, and even perform the correct response. But they do not fully inhabit the emotional experience itself. They become observers of their own feelings rather than participants in them. This can look like maturity, but internally it often leads to emotional isolation. Feelings are treated as problems to solve rather than experiences to live through. Compounding this is the reality that giftedness often involves heightened sensitivity. Many gifted individuals experience what psychologists describe as overexcitabilities, increased intensity across intellectual, emotional, sensory, psychomotor, or creative domains. This can manifest as deep curiosity, but also as anxiety, sensory overwhelm, existential dread, or emotional reactivity at a young age. In standard educational environment, these traits are rarely accommodated. Boredom is punished, sensitivity is misunderstood, intensity is pathologized. As a result, many gifted children learn to suppress or mask parts of themselves in order to function normally. This is why some experts argue that gifted children are, in effect, special needs students, not because they're deficient, but because they do not thrive in systems designed for average cognitive and emotional profiles. Without proper support, their development becomes uneven and fragile. By adulthood, all of these factors converge. A fragile identity built on intelligence, a paralyzing burden of potential, emotional development that lagged behind cognitive ability, and a deep, unspoken sense of shame about time, progress, and unrealized futures. By adulthood, many former gifted children begin to notice something unsettling. They're alone. Not necessarily physically isolated, but socially disconnected in a way that feels difficult to articulate. Conversations feel shallow. Relationships feel unsatisfying. There's a persistent sense of being out of sync with the people around them, as though everyone else is operating on a different frequency. And at first, this disconnection is confusing, and then it becomes painful, and eventually, for many, it becomes defended. Psychologically, when belonging is threatened, the mind looks for ways to restore stability. If connection feels unavailable, meaning must be preserved somewhere else. For the former gifted child, that meaning often collapses back into the only identity that ever worked: intelligence. This is where defensive arrogance emerges. Defensive arrogance is not the belief that one is better than others. It is the belief that others are incapable of understanding you. It is a way of reframing loneliness as superiority. If no one understands you, it must be because you are too deep, too complex, too intelligent for them. This narrative is comforting because it preserves self-worth and doesn't require them to be vulnerable with their own feelings and inadequacies. Rather than confronting the pain of not fitting in, the mind reframes disconnection as distinction. When you ask, "Why can't I connect?" it answers, "Because they can't keep up." Over time, this story becomes self-sealing. Any failed interaction reinforces the belief. The tragedy is that this belief system feels rational. Gifted individuals often do think differently. They may enjoy abstraction, nuance, or complexity in ways that maybe others don't. But the leap from different to above is where isolation hardens into identity. At that point, intelligence is no longer a bridge, it becomes a hard brick wall. This dynamic also explains why some gifted adults gravitate towards social environments where they feel intellectually dominant. Surrounding oneself with people perceived as less intelligence offers a sense of safety. There's no risk of exposure, no threat to the ego, there's no chance of being outpaced. This is sometimes described as the midwit problem. The gifted individual avoids peers who might challenge them, not consciously, but emotionally. They prefer environments where they can maintain their self-concept without any friction. But the cost of this safety is stagnation. Growth requires being challenged. Connection requires equality, and neither can exist when superiority is a non-negotiable. As a result, the gifted adult lives inside a closed psychological loop. They feel disconnected. They explain the disconnection through superiority. They choose environments that reinforce that belief. Those environments limit growth and intimacy, which deepens the disconnection, and all around it goes. This loop is reinforced by another pattern: intellectualization. Gifted individuals are exceptionally good at thinking about things. This includes thinking about social situations, emotions, and even personal change. The problem is that thinking becomes a substitute for doing. The mind simulates experiences rather than engaging in them. Rather than going to a party, the gifted adult imagines it. They predict the conversations, the boredom, the superficiality, and so they decide that it's not worth it and stay home. Rather than starting a project, they mentally map out the obstacles and decide that it's too risky and not worth the effort. Rather than trying something unfamiliar, they analyze it to the point of certainty that it will fail. And because the simulation feels detailed, it feels real, it feels logically sound, and it feels correct. Psychologically, the brain does not distinguish between imagined and lived experience when emotional prediction is involved. So the gifted adult comes to believe they already know how things will turn out. The world becomes predictable, dull, and unworthy of engagement, not because it actually is, but because it has never been properly encountered. And this keeps them trapped in this abstraction. Life becomes something to be understood rather than lived and experienced. And experience itself becomes optional. Actions become unnecessary because change only occurs through experience, not insight, so nothing actually changes. This is why it's so difficult to advise a gifted adult. They'll dissect everything you say, analyze the edge cases, point out expectations, and convince themselves that they are in fact a special case, that their situation is more complex, more nuanced, more unique than whatever framework that you're suggesting. In reality, their intellect is working on behalf of the ego. Rather than being used to grow, intellect is used to defend. It finds reasons not to try. It finds flaws in every suggestion. It reframes inaction as discernment. And because the argument sounds intelligent, they are difficult to challenge. This is known as the help-rejecting pattern. The gifted adult understands the advice, they may even agree with it in principle, but they never apply it. Application would require stepping into uncertainty, risking failure, and dismantling the identity that says that they are already above such basic solutions. And so they remain stuck, aware enough to see the problem, intelligent enough to explain it, but emotionally unable to move through it. Over time, this creates a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of effort, but the exhaustion of potential energy. So much thought, so little motion. So many internal models, so little reality. Life begins to feel unreal, stalled, as though it's happening somewhere else. And yet, despite all of this, the situation isn't hopeless. The very mechanisms that keep gifted individuals trapped also contain the seeds of their release. The same intelligence that defends the ego can be redirected. The same awareness that fuels rumination can be used for dismantling identity. But doing so requires something counterintuitive. It requires letting go of being special. You may wonder how I know so much about the reality of a gifted kid. Well, it's because, you might have predicted this already, I was one. I was made to skip grades because I was ahead of all my peers. I taken college philosophy classes while in high school, getting top of the class with very little effort. The whole shebang. But you may have noticed throughout this entire video, I never spoke in the first person. I didn't say I or we. And that's because the only way to heal from the struggles of being a former gifted kid is to let go of that identity. You need to let go of that story that you have always been told and that you have been telling yourself. The story that once explained everything, that once protected you and allowed you to make sense of your difference, your boredom, your isolation, and unrealized potential. The story of being gifted. This identity often survives far longer than it should. Even after academic success fades, even after life becomes complicated, even after comparison turns painful, the label remains. It lingers in the background as a quiet justification of everything. I could have been something extraordinary. Well, that identity is a trap, because it is built on conditional worth. It says, you matter if you become what you were supposed to be. Your value is deferred to a future version of yourself, and until that version exists, you are incomplete. Healing requires dismantling this identity entirely. Psychologically, this feels like grief, and like all grief, it comes with denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. The denial often looks like endless self-analysis. The anger looks like resentment towards systems, parents, teachers, or society. The bargaining looks like waiting for the perfect project, the perfect moment, the perfect plan. The depression looks like paralysis. Acceptance looks like something far quieter. It is admitting that in many domains you are average, that your intelligence does not exempt you from effort, that you are not special in the ways that you were told and you once believed. And for someone whose entire self-concept was built around being exceptional, this feels like annihilation. Trust me, I went through it. But I can assure you that it isn't. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's liberation. The gifted identity collapses because it was never meant to be permanent. It was a childhood adaptation, not a lifelong blueprint. It helped the child survive environments that didn't meet their needs. It gave them meaning when effort wasn't required. But adulthood demands something else of us entirely. It demands being human before being impressive. One of the most difficult steps in this process is accepting what many gifted adults privately fear most: being stupid in certain areas. Struggling socially, failing emotionally, being inconsistent, being slow, making ordinary mistakes, doing things badly for a long time. Although these things often feel like regression, they're really not. They're just development finally catching up with us. The gifted child skipped critical developmental stages. Healing requires going back and building up those foundations. study habits, emotional regulation, tolerance for frustration, the ability to fail without self-erasure. These are not glamorous skills. They do not feel intellectual. And that is precisely why they were avoided. Letting go of the gifted identity also means challenging the belief that effort is beneath you. Many gifted adults intellectually agree that effort matters, but emotionally they resist it. Effort feels humiliating. It feels like proof that the myth wasn't true. The moment you stop trying to preserve an image of intelligence, well, effort becomes more neutral. It's no longer a referendum on who you are as a person. It is simply the cost of doing anything meaningful. This shift is captured well by an ancient idea from the Bhagavad Gita, karma versus phala. You are entitled to the action, not the outcome. To the work, not the reward. To the process, not the praise. From being conditioned to tie your worth to outcomes like grades, recognition, achievement, the Gita's framing breaks that link. You show up because showing up is the point. You write because writing is the only way to become a great writer. You try because trying is what humans do. When outcome is removed from identity, perfectionism loses its grip. This also means confronting the special case narrative, the belief that standard advice doesn't apply to you, that your situation is uniquely complex, that boring solutions won't work. This belief is comforting, absolutely, because it preserves uniqueness, but it is also a form of avoidance. The laws of effort apply to everyone. No amount of intelligence exempts you from practice. No amount of insight replaces experience. No amount of theory substitutes for repetition. And the moment you accept this, the world becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. Another critical step is lowering your expectations. And hey, this does not mean abandoning your ambition. It means releasing the imagined mansion, letting go of the future self that was never real, accepting the current reality as the starting point rather than a disappointment. Lowering expectations closes the shame gap. When you stop measuring yourself against an impossible ideal, the present becomes tolerable. Action becomes possible. Small progress stops feeling insulting, and ironically, this is when real growth begins. Many gifted adults discover that once the pressure to be exceptional dissolves, energy returns, creativity resurfaces, curiosity becomes playful rather than compulsive, and life regains texture. But there is one final metaphor that captures this entire psychological journey. The gifted brain is like a Ferrari. Incredible engine, exceptional horsepower, designed for speed and complexity. But if you never learn how to drive it, if you never develop emotional regulation, discipline, and patience, then it doesn't matter how powerful the engine is, you're going to drive that car into a wall. And if you place that Ferrari in traffic, in a system designed for average speeds, well, it's going to overheat, it stalls, it breaks down. Meanwhile, that junky old Toyota Camry is just driving right past you with no difficulty. And not because they're a superior machine, but because they are built for the environment. They're reliable. They move consistently. They don't depend on ideal conditions to function. Healing isn't about becoming faster. It's about learning how to drive your Ferrari and finally building a highway where you can thrive. The tragedy of the gifted child is not that they fail to become extraordinary. It's that they are never taught on how to become ordinary. Ordinary in the psychological sense does not mean mediocre. It means embodied. It means capable of effort, failure, repair, and continuation. It means having a self that can survive contact with reality without shattering. The gifted child was rewarded for bypassing reality, for skipping steps, for solving problems without engaging the process, and for a while, sure, it worked. But adulthood does not reward shortcuts. It rewards consistency. It rewards resilience. It rewards people who know how to keep going when nothing feels impressive. By the time the former gifted child realizes this, they are often already exhausted, not from effort, but from avoidance. Not from trying too hard, but from never learning how to try at all. And this is why the crash feels so disorienting. They don't fail gradually. They stall. Life for them stops moving forward. Life passes, but nothing changes. And because their identity was built on potential rather than process, they have no framework for rebuilding. What makes this especially painful is that the gifted individual can usually explain what's wrong. They understand the patterns, they can articulate the psychology, they can even diagnose themselves. But insight alone does not create motion, and motion is the only thing that heals. Healing begins when intelligence stops being the center of gravity, not when it disappears, but when it becomes just one trait among many, when it no longer defines worth. This requires a fundamental shift in how the self is organized. The gifted identity says, I am valuable if I'm exceptional. The grounded identity says, I'm valuable because I'm engaged. Engagement replaces performance. Presence replaces promise. Process replaces potential. At this point, the efficiency trap dissolves. The brain no longer seeks the cheapest path to validation because validation is no longer the goal. The goal becomes participation, showing up, doing the work, being in the world. Effort stops feeling like evidence of inadequacy and starts feeling like proof of life. The mansion blueprint fades into irrelevance. There is no grand future self awaiting to arrive. There's only what you build today with the tools you have in the conditions that exist. And it turns out that's enough. Socially, this shift changes everything. When you no longer need to be superior, connection becomes possible. Conversations stop being evaluations. Relationships stop being a means to stroke your ego. You no longer need to be understood as exceptional to feel seen. You can meet people where they are, not above them. Defensive arrogance dissolves because it's no longer needed. The world stops being full of people who just don't get it and becomes full of people who are simply human, different, flawed, and also complex in their own unique ways. The help rejection cycle breaks because advice is no longer a threat. You don't need solutions to preserve your identity. You need them to live. And suddenly, boring advice works. Do the work. Start small. Be consistent. Fail publicly. Try again. Not because you're special, because you are human. This is also where emotional development catches up. Feelings are no longer problems to solve or narratives to analyze. They are experiences to tolerate. You learn to sit with discomfort without intellectualizing it away. You learn to stay present when things are messy, uncertain, or slow. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, life begins to move again for you. Not dramatically, not heroically, but steadily. You learn how to drive your Ferrari. A final irony, I think, is this. Many former gifted children do eventually become extraordinary, but not in the way they imagined. Not as prodigies or untouchable minds, but as people who understand struggle, humility, and process deeply. They become extraordinary because they know what it means to rebuild a self from the ground up, and that knowledge cannot be gifted. It has to be earned. The psychology of the gifted child is not a story about wasted potential. It is a story about misdirected development, a system that confused intelligence with identity, ease with ability, and promise with worth. Healing is not about reclaiming the gift. It is about letting it go. When you stop trying to be gifted, you finally get to just be.